فين؟
انتم حتى ما خلصتوش وقتكم 25 دقيقة. لا حلوين 25 دقيقة. Okay, dear organizers, could we have half an hour?
For the discussion?
Yes.
Let's see how the
Yeah, but maximum half an hour.
Yes.
Okay? So we have half an hour. Please, Dr. Nader.
تمثيل ياسمين لريم مش هي المسؤولة.
لا هي مش مسؤولة أبدا، ده شخص مش مسؤول. تفضل.
This is an additional comment to Marion's presentation on the food industry in Egypt. You probably know that a few days ago the US FDA has planned a very serious restriction on imports of food products from Egypt. Interestingly, almost immediately followed by Saudi Arabia. The interesting point is that not only fresh and frozen fruits and vegetables were impacted, but most dairy products, including products manufactured by some of the big firms you referred to. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I mean, I want to bring Bilkis into this discussion because quite a lot of people, when they speak to me from Yemen, point out the degree to which the Yemeni market is now flooded products, food products, processed food products from the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. And incredible though it seems, given the rich agriculture, the secondary level of the global food system, i.e. the processing level, may have interests that we're not taking into account often. So I appreciate your, but it's just, even in the midst of war, this, I mean, which is not a new idea, but that the processed food sector may be very powerful.
Well, it's a fantastic panel, no question. A couple of observations. One to Marion, really, which is to think about the extent to which global value chains, which is a very popular discourse amongst some social scientists, is flawed, really, as an analytical concept with what it is that you presented, because global value chains are presented as being market-driven, anti-monopoly, open and accessible to a whole range of those actors involved in the chain. And what you really kind of lay out is how it becomes au contraire, that actually there is some inclusion, but it's very uneven. And I just wonder whether I could push you a bit more in terms of how you think, because you did make a very particular point towards the end, that smallholders aren't excluded, but they are included in some way. I'm just wondering what the measure of that inclusion is, to what extent, and what kind of value, more generally defined. For Reem, for both of you really, I mean, I think, is it a foolish question to ask you? To what extent do you think you have either evidence or a hunch? Hunches are good. I like hunches. To what extent do you think the exclusion of farmers from the detail of the different cases you illustrated is intentional as an active form of exclusion? And I would use the term, and I've used it before, of course, abjection. That actually, abjection here is a term which defines the expelling of people from the development process, which is an active process of de-development through a number of different mechanisms, some of which we've discussed over the last couple of days. Is this do you think you have either a hunch or detail in terms of exploring how that is contrived and constructed by the state? Or is it just, as we might say in English, the cock-up theory of decision-making and bureaucratic management, that actually it's just the state not managing to do things very well, things fall down by the wayside, it's a bureaucratic mess, who cares really what's going on, that these things are meddlesome and unfortunate, but they're not intentional. I want really some sense of, are we now exploring another illustration of the ratcheting down of family farming, smallholders, as an intentional way in which the state is effectively promoting social engineering?
Thank you all very much. I also thought it was a fantastic panel, but my question is actually a pretty narrow one for Roland. I was wondering how you define holdings and what the categories that we saw there can obscure. And I'm thinking because holdings aren't necessarily productive units. And when we think about fragmentation as well, fragmenting of ownership or holding doesn't necessarily result in fragmentation of use. And so I'm wondering how you can get behind those statistics and see what actual land use is behind this notion of a holding and what our unit of analysis is for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, the panel was just brilliant. So I have a question for each one of you. So for Roland, so we have questions. This time I'm trying to follow Marion advice. So Roland, so you gave us this kind of wonderful historical genealogy of the trajectory of how land, communal land is being titled, privatized. But I lost you a little bit, in terms of course, the trajectory was very long. So I was wondering, because you kind of explaining this process, again, giving it, profound historical roots. I was wondering how contemporary changes in food regimes or in commercialization can be seen as further elements that are consolidating this trend. Right? I was wondering how, kind of in contemporary period, this long-term trend is being reinforced or not. Right? So that's the question. So then for Reem, I'm also very interested in the food sovereignty paradigm. So I was wondering, so I was captured by the very last phrase you said, that the idea of sovereignty was attractive in many ways to Egyptian farmers because it called back some kind of nationalist notion. And you were also referring to Edelman. But Edelman has also a critique of the notion of sovereignty, and he basically says that this concept is a little bit kind of top-down, allow me this, in the sense that it is brought in social reality. Social realities in the global south, but in many ways does not have necessarily ontological foundation in its reality. So Edelman basically saying that this is a concept that comes from the outside, and for example, quoting Latin American peasants, he thinks that notion of insecurity or seguridad, right, is more pertinent to the actual realities of insecurity. So I would like you, if you could articulate more about how this concept is locally grounded, or if you think this is just being catapulted from the outside. And then a couple of, something for Marion. So the first is a question. So, of course, I like your emphasis on the agro-food industry as an analytical concept and how you're breaking it down. I think that's a very good methodology because sometimes we remain to this kind of macro sort of level of analysis. But I was wondering, to what extent the processes you are defining in terms of, again, expelling some of the farmers can be, and concentration of the sugar industry can also be read through the prism of land reform, right? I mean, the land tenure reform in Egypt, it seems to me, highly announced these processes of concentration exactly because it made land tenure for small-scale farmers more precarious. But I didn't see, any mention in your presentation on the way in which the agri-food chain and its consolidation and concentration is being shaped by it. And then there is a second point, which is a little bit more about a clarification. So your argument was a bit half the way. I mean, at a certain point you were saying small-scale farmers are being excluded. At another point you were saying that they are now being included in more indirect, informal ways. I think, my evidence from Africa is that there is another trend, and the trend is for a renewal of contract farming. A renewal of contract farming. I mean, if you look at Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, you see that contract farming is being brought back on the agenda, actually as a way multinational capital is trying to avoid the critiques of grabbing. So this is a very, in a sense, a very recent trend. So it's like, I'd like to know how you think about this, because my sense is that these big companies need to be on the market 12 months a year, right? And in order to do so, they need farmers' work. So yes, there is a trend which is moving towards displacement, but there is also another trend, which is for integrating adverse incorporation, if you like. So I would like to know your thought about this. Thank you. Sorry for
Last question, Omar? Yeah, okay, yeah.
In France, en tout cas, moi j'ai beaucoup aimé le dernier tableau sur le Liban, hein, et je peux vous assurer qu'au Maroc, vous trouvez pareil, hein, que les mêmes grosses deltes qui consomment beaucoup d'eau avec de grandes superficies. Ça, ce qui est intéressant, c'est vraiment ce croisement, cette hybridation entre la consommation de l'eau et de la terre. Et je dis ça parce que ça m'a beaucoup conforté l'exposé de Yasmine et Reem qui parle de ce débat entre chercheurs et de paysans, parce que très souvent quand on parle de la régulation de grandes voitures, on parle souvent d'ostro, on parle souvent des règles, comment on gère un petit périmètre, mais on ne parle pas des grands. Et c'est les grands qui consomment beaucoup d'eau. C'est les grands qui consomment une agriculture exportatrice. Et du coup, ça nous interpelle justement sur quel type de fellah, quel type d'agriculteur, quel type de métier, d'identité, mais aussi de taille, hein, parce que c'est important. Et on enseigne souvent dans les écoles d'agro, on enseigne souvent le modèle de gros, moderne, tout ça, mais c'est les petits qui sont là, qui font la tractation et qui ont des règles en place ancestrales dans les oasis, dans les montagnes et tout ça. Alors que les grands, ils n'ont pas de règles, donc une règle de tragédie en commun. Et puis voilà, le topo est très clair. Alors, je ne pouvais pas m'épargner, mais c'est juste pour la food security. En regardant le titre, je voyais la région MENA. Je n'ai pas trouvé le MENA dans l'exposé, je trouvais que l'Égypte. Et je dis ça en n'étant pas neutre, parce que c'est pour moi, en tant que Marocain, c'est très difficile, en tant que sociologue, de parler généralisé sur le Maroc. Alors, pour aller au MENA, il faut nuancer, je pense, hein, mais je ne me suis pas permis.
Thank you. Latest question? No? Okay, so please, Roland?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Well,
if you want, you can have 5 minutes.
yeah, I think it's. So actually, for your questions about holdings, you were asking me. So actually, it's the FAO definition that was just given also in the census of Egypt, which is a moral or a physical person that can that has a productive entity that can have like many parcels, or so this is mainly the reason. And for sure here to track how, for instance, is this merger happening or this divisibility in terms of inheritance? It's actually quite difficult to capture having this kind of data. So, so it's actually under three measures. It's the physical or moral entity, being productive, and having a specific size of land. So those are the three kind of definitions to define a holdings. Julian, thank you for your question. According to, I'm really sorry, yeah, it was true that, well, the length of, it's not a longue durée, but it's still like a half of century. Well, actually, where do we place ourselves in a food regime? I think that we have to come back with a world system economy also integrated to this food regime. We are actually at the periphery of the Gulf countries, where we actually the only place where we have market. It's not Europe, like the case of other North African countries, but it's actually the center here is the Gulf country. Well, we are seeing it's actually shaken now with the Syrian crisis. We are not able to foresee our market. So I think this last food regime is actually maybe, I don't know, it's actually under shake, you know, it's disrupted. Of course, there is also the concentration of this corporate and like neoliberal that Ray was just talking in this supply chain. How can we, it's actually, it's not competition, but we actually detecting concentration between those that own large lands, that own the means of production and depleting the groundwaters, that own the machineries, that own the subsidies, that own the trade routes, that, you know, that own the means of production. So there's a concentration in this supply chain that is clear. Yeah, another concerning Morocco, I was wondering if you can reach actually this raw data, and how would you deal? It's a question for you when you are confronted into, like, for instance, Hassan II owning this part of land, or, you know, maybe it's kind of a politically incorrect in terms of to deal with it. I'm actually confronted with this situation, you know. Thank you.
Thank you. Marion?
Yeah. Okay, so how can I just...
Sorry.
So Martha's point and Ray's question and point, I'll start with that, because of course I was feeling very rushed, and this is just a very brief description of the analytic. Food processing in Egypt is the biggest way in which capital accumulation happens within the corporate food system. And to put it just to say nationally, the greatest, most of what food processors want, I just gave the example of dairy, but we can say tomatoes, potatoes, are major commodities that food processors want, are dominated by fellahin. So one point, I didn't get to this, is that there's been a... Yeah, they're the dominant producers, produce and they sell in the market. So one point is the reconstitution of smallholder farming that has actually made, for example, corporate dairy possible, because smallholders in Egypt have been producing more and more animal products, including milk, including animal feed. So, that's more of a theoretical point, is the reconstitution toward animal protein that has made this possible. Okay, so Giuliani's point, thank you for your questions. So that's the thing, is that there's both happening in Egypt. I mean, that's the point of the analytic. What can be, and this is, you know, coming straight from rural agrarian studies, is the exclusion of smallholders from a direct consumer market as supermarkets and hypermarkets gain more of the direct consumer market. But that is, at the same time, simultaneously, smallholders and vendors are incorporated in various ways adversely into corporate food value chains. So it's both happening simultaneously. And in Egypt, actually one of the reasons why I looked into this is looking at dispossession of smallholders from land and what was happening to that land. It wasn't going into the hands of agribusiness largely. It was going into the hand of military or for real estate development. So the question of land, actually, it's in Egypt, the agri-food industry has been able to grow through land reclamation, the expansion of new lands. So that's a different dynamic, and it has lots of implications historically and presently for the existing agricultural lands in the Delta and Nile Valley. But I don't want to go into that now. That wasn't my presentation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Reem and Yasmine.
Okay, I think for the question of the hunch, the idea of the official data and the official statistics is a very good example, especially when we look at it in light of the new health insurance law. You have a situation where the bureaucratic technical state apparatus provides the perfect platform, for the exclusion of small farmers and agricultural workers who are meant to be the beneficiaries of the law. So I think the idea of the technical versus the political, they blur very well in this example. So initially, you have a law that was done for political purposes, basically for broadening the base of the insured population as per the constitution, actually. And then a law was issued very, very quickly without, a proper estimation for numbers and government spending and budgets, etc. You have very obscure data sets. That's why the work that Francois presented yesterday is very useful for government officials as well, only if they read it. And then you have two state entities who are responsible for the implementation and who have very conflicting ideas about who the fallah is. One actually does not use this term at all and deals with it as a cultural resignation, and the other one uses it. So I do think that this is a good example of deliberate exclusion that is done thanks to the bureaucratic apparatus, in a sense. So that's my take on this. I think Remy will add back on the rest of the question. Food sovereignty. Food sovereignty.
Okay. Yes, I'll address mainly the question about the food sovereignty from Julian. Yes, indeed, Edelman looked critically at how the notion of food sovereignty is applied and what does it mean exactly, sovereignty, and at what level, the local or the communal, or this is yes, of course. And when I said that the idea of sovereignty had a pleasing effect on nationalist ears, I was mainly also referring to the people, the politicians and the people in the parliament, because it did not pass easily. And when it passed, actually, it was not, it was mainly because I don't think anybody there quite knew what that meant or what the implications are. No, that's why I think we are delaying for the moment doing anything with this, because if we talk about it now or the implications, the next time the constitution is going to be modified, it will go. So anyway, but the idea of yes, it is a concept that is being discussed. It is debatable and fine, but in fact, this is in the realm of action. I think it was quite an achievement to get it into the constitution, to get it enshrined into the constitution, and then we can discuss later what it means exactly. But in this case, it was clear that it, in a simple and direct way, it has to do with the idea of preserving local varieties, preserving agrobiodiversity, putting the more power in the hands of the direct producers. So we need this very much as a political tool. The other part of the debate is should not hamper us. Whether it is a foreign or outside idea, yes, and why not? It is not more foreign than the language of the World Bank that is becoming a part of everyday life in villages and people. And also, frankly, farmers and farmers leaders or ordinary farmers, they would like to learn new things. It is not. I'm not ashamed to say that yes, maybe this is part of the deal, part of working together. Meaning that I learn new things, they learn new things from me. I'm not ashamed, but to keep away things that come from outside, from the farmers, is really patronizing. They are agents, they have full agency. They can decide for themselves whether they want to take something from the outside or not, whether they like it or not, whether they want to destroy their land or build houses on it or not. And then I fight with them as an environmental activist, for example. So it's, they're not really fragile creatures who will collapse at the first foreign notion coming their way. Sorry for being sarcastic. Yes. Maybe another part of maybe slight kind of evidence or hunch that the state is excluding the peasants has to do, if you look at the discussions again during the formation of the constitution, because the farmers really did organize themselves rather well and presented demands. And one of the things that they were keen about is to keep the 50% of the farmers and workers. But this this demand was not included in the constitution. And they considered, and rightly so, this to be a very serious blow to their political weight, or even the symbolic idea of farmers at all. And with this, so this was not just a matter of form, it had implications. And maybe if I can add something little bit that has to do maybe not just with small farmers, the state versus the small farmers, but the idea of the rural in general, and the rural-urban divide and the neglect of the rural. Because, and this has to do with the rural-urban dynamic that is, this is another conversation, and it's complicated, but you see that many of the villages are actually ripe for an urban status, but they don't get this status because this entails other services and amenities which you're not getting. So you get not an unrecognized urbanism, which, as Eric Denis and Bayet would say, unrecognized, it's actually unrealized urbanism. And to add to this, many these problems gave rise to kinds of protests that were particularly apparent in the decade from 2005 to 2010. Most of the rural protest at that time was not related to agriculture, but was related to the residential part of the village. And surprisingly, and this is something that I've documented actually, the most violent protests at that time was due to ecological, environmental reasons, and the most violent of them, that include deaths and killing, had to do with the resistance to the erection of the mobile phone towers. And they had a very, very clear pattern with the involvement of women and youth and people organizing themselves in the village to track when the car of the company was coming, and the way they attacked was really, and of course demands for clean water, demands for pedestrian bridges. So all of these things, they had to do these demands for citizenship entitlements for the residential parts of the village, and these were being denied mainly by the very arbitrary way in which the title city is being granted. What is a city is even a more obscure question than what a fallah is.
Trade unions,
Trade unions? طب قولي بقى انت.
One last evidence for the objection, if you wish, concerns the right to organize. So you have very systematic, ways of excluding farmers from the organizing efforts that we discussed in this paper. These no longer exist, by the way. One is the trade union, and the other is the cooperative laws. So there was an interest in the idea of cooperatives, farmers, small farmers, but then there are like numerous laws that deals with the idea of what a cooperative is, and there are different ministries having decrees concerning the how to run a cooperative and the legal status of a cooperative, etc. So it never materialized into anything concrete. But the other more strong evidence is the almost disappearance of trade unions as a result of the non-materialization of the actual law. So basically, a declaration was issued after the uprisings, and initially it was supposed to be transformed into a law, but this never happened. Not only that, there was the protest law that actually deprived groups from protesting, etc. So it almost killed the independent trade union movement. So I think you have.
Can you come, please?
Very quickly. I like that clause in the law because siada is a strong Arabic word, not only for nationalists, and it has no legal meaning usually at all, but you had enough clauses around it that gave it a little flesh to negotiate, I would say, in defense vis-a-vis Giuliano. But my major question is, how is it with that definition of a holding that you don't count the same piece of land twice, once for the owner and once for a tenant? I just don't understand, because it's not linked to to the land on the ground exactly. Yeah.
Well, the tenant does not exist anymore in the records. It only exists in.
I mean, that's Egypt, but we have the same problem.
Yeah.
The tenant doesn't exist.
Well, the land is the piece of land is not registered twice because it's only a landholder. There is no tenant in the census. There is no tenant in the agricultural cooperatives. There is no. It's not recognizable at all. So. Yes. Exactly.
Can be an owner or can be a tenant.
Exactly.
But if you have a lot of absentee land ownership, as you do in this country, maybe not so much in Egypt, it's very easy that you get, not absentee from the actual village, but living a few villages down.
Yeah.
How do you get this is a question more for Roland than it is perhaps.
Because for me the case is quite clear. You have the record that has the number of owners. The tenants were completely disappeared after the implementation of the land tenancy.
Okay, so they're not registering.
They're not registered.
It's time for lunch. So please continue the discussion around the lunch. We go for 40 minutes?
45.
45 minutes. This is the order from the